Okay, so anyways, I want to talk today about a project that I've kind of been working on, in different ways for like 8 years. So it's a little different than I think the topics that are usually held here. And one reason I'd like to spend more time on question and answer, assuming I can get through my talk quickly, is that it's pretty broad. It's also pretty abstract. It's more philosophical. It's not nuts and bolts policy, even though I promise at the end to try to tie it a little bit in to policy, or at least to the idea of being a classical liberal or a libertarian in the policy world, or even just caring about politics. But so it's kind of like, it was definitely an issue where it's harder for me to figure out what to talk about than having enough to talk about. So I hope that it gives a broad introduction into this idea of spiritual freedom, which as I say, is part of this large project. And maybe we can chat afterwards as well about whether this matters. Because I think there's a couple different ways that you guys could leave. One way could be, well, that's actually kind of interesting. Maybe this aspect of freedom, spiritual freedom that he's talking about, is undervalued or doesn't get enough press. Or you could leave going, well, clearly that's why that guy's in the academic world. He doesn't have to worry about anything real. He can just talk about whatever he wants to. So I'm hoping that won't happen, but there's a chance. So in any case, what I want to talk to you today about is spiritual freedom. Now that is something that, of course, is very broad and ambiguous. One way to try to cut through the ambiguity is to talk about what it would mean to be a free spirit. Now, a free spirit is a sort of new agey term. That's not that sort of idea you have of free spirit that Hollywood's giving you, wear less clothes and go live in the woods and that kind of thing. That's not really what I'm talking about. I'll try to be more precise about it, but try to get that image out of your head. But before I actually talk about spiritual freedom, preface it by summarizing the way I think freedom is generally talked about in society. I think that in politics and public discourse in the media, you get a sort of filtered version of the discussions of freedom that happen at a different level, either a legal level, like the court system, or in the academic world. And I just want to say a couple things about that before we get going. So we know that freedom here in America, and one might say the Western world in general, is not just licensed to do whatever one wishes. Right? It's an ordered liberty that we have. There's a framework of liberty. There's rules, right? There's a framework that prevents us from sliding into chaos, anarchy, or license, right? Those aren't the free states we care about, even though we might say in an anarchic world there is a lot of freedom. That's really not what we're after. We're after an ordered liberty. And there seem to be two ways in which this framework of liberty, or this ordered liberty, is talked about. And it depends on the group doing the talking. The first I'm going to talk about, just to mention briefly, is legal, and then the second, academic. And as I mentioned, I think both of these ways of talking about liberty are reflected in public discourse later on down the line. So just a easy example, in the legal system, we continue to debate issues and adjudicate cases surrounding civil liberties and civil rights, right? The question, should the Christian baker have to bake the cake for a gay wedding? Can we justify affirmative action on the basis of our constitutional rights? Right? These are questions about liberty, how far it extends, what the sphere and scope of it is. And then the answers to these questions ultimately come through the court system. So the courts have a very, very big role in determining our real and practical sphere of ordered liberty. On the academic side of things, we see political scientists, philosophers, economists, historians. They talk a lot about institutions, right? Institutions, really the rules of the game, the rules of liberty. So the questions here are, how should political and economic institutions be arranged? What can be changed, tweaked? How can we evaluate whether the rules that we have set up are actually giving us liberty or not? So questions in this academic side of things might be, would a minimum income make us more or less free? Would a flat tax make us more or less free? What about occupational licensing? Questions like this. Or they might ask, how would institutions, government and political and economic institutions, have to be arranged to satisfy some sort of goal? What do we want to be in society? Philosophers might ask. Do we want to be free and equal persons? This is a Rawlsian idea. If you've heard of John Rawls, that's what he thinks we should try to be. Should we be self-authors or self-owners? Think of John Locke. There's an idea of self-ownership. That's what we want, a society of self-owners. So then the question is, how should we set up political and economic institutions to make sure that that goal is reached? And that's sort of a standard by which we judge whether it's a free society. So these debates can be pretty abstract. But then I think when we go to public discourse, media, in general, the general discussion around politics, you'll see these sorts of arguments come up, usually for a side trying to support or defend its position. Ours is a more free policy prescription, for example. But what I really want to talk about or mention here as I slowly get into talking about spiritual freedom is that in our society, in the West in general, and in America in particular, we've become sophisticated and practical when we talk about liberty. Right? We almost get technical about it. Liberty is ordered, and we can talk in fairly specific terms about how that order is going to be achieved, how that order might be threatened. Now, I don't think this is a bad thing. I don't have like a big bone to pick with this, because in a lot of ways this is progress, right? This is the progress of political science and of politics in general. But I think that we should be wary of talking about freedom and liberty only, or even primarily, in such sophisticated and practical ways. As much as, at the risk of sounding, too dramatic or Hollywoodish, I think there's a deeper wellspring of freedom. It's one that's more romantic, it's more inspiring, and it's more generative, which I'll talk about that a little bit later, being more generative. And this is what I call spiritual freedom. I think that liberation movements in general, political liberation movements, there's often a lot of practical nuts and bolts issues at play, but there's also this sort of, some might even call it naive feeling of we're fighting for freedom. I sometimes use the example in class of the movie Braveheart. I'm assuming, have all the interns seen Braveheart? Is Braveheart? I hope it's still required watching. Because Mel Gibson, he went through some tough times, but he's kind of coming back. So it's okay to like him again, I think. In Braveheart, the last scene, where not the very last scene, but when Mel Gibson is tortured and ultimately dies, right, he screams out freedom at the very end, like his dying breath. And I think we can't say, well, he wasn't just thinking about a flat tax at that point, right? Or he wasn't just thinking about, property rights being upheld in his district. It's a very, very romantic and inspired idea of freedom that he's talking about. And I think that this sort of feeling can be found throughout liberation movements throughout history, and this runs deeper than just civil liberties or institutions. Again, though, I want to say I think those things are very important. I see this more as an addition or like something to remember when we talk about freedom, not that it should supplant those other discussions that we tend to have. Okay, but so what is spiritual freedom exactly? Is the focus on spirituality? Is it intellectual freedom? What is it? This could go on for a long time. I'm going to, brief with this description of it, but I welcome any sort of questions you might have later on. I conceive of spiritual freedom as a combination of intellectual freedom, freedom of thought, and a concern with spirituality, which would with what I call spiritual fullness, a positive spiritual state, something that makes you want to affirm your life and affirm the world. Of course, that's a big idea, but just the general sense that a lot of people have that they want to achieve spiritual fullness in their life. So spiritual freedom is concerned with both of these things. Right? If we are not intellectually free, then our thoughts are somehow not our own. They haven't been self-generated, and in some sense, we feel like a prisoner to the thoughts of others. So I think, that's something too. When you look at liberation movements, there's a sort of romantic idea that I need to be free to think and say and act as I do, and that again is something I think that's bigger than what you generally see in a court case or in talk of institutions. So what is a free spirit? A free spirit is going to be somebody who is both intellectually free and free to pursue spiritual fullness on his or her own terms. Using this free spirit concept, what I'm really trying to do is embody the idea of spiritual freedom so it becomes easier to talk about. And then we can start to look and say, well, how does spiritual freedom relate to politics? In other words, how is a free spirit defined in this way going to relate to politics and society? How involved would they be? What sort of activities will they engage in? And then spiritual fullness, again, we can talk more about that, but I'm just going to leave it as that positive spiritual state. So here's some basic criteria for a free spirit. They are a skeptic who seeks above all to be free of illusions about the world, one who is reluctant to adopt established doctrines about the meaning of life in the world and would rather arrive at or create his or her own meaning. And that almost sounds relativist and postmodern, but I use Nietzsche's free spirit as a guide here, and it's a little more tethered to reality than that. So just don't worry about that being too relative at this point. For a free spirit is someone for whom independence of mind, or as Nietzsche claims, a free, fearless hovering over things, is the highest value. It's the most desirable condition. That means that actually having the freedom to think and act as you would as an individual with your own, by creating your meaning, is more important to you than being tethered to family, tradition, political movements, ideas, utopian ideas about politics or association. So it's a higher value than fitting in or being accepted by the general community. It's a solitary task, and it does in some way make these sorts of human beings outsiders. I didn't say outcasts, outsiders, right? They choose to be this way. They're not cast out by society. So the free spirit affirms life and creates value in life in ways that are different than the traditional moral perspectives or religious doctrines that the majority of individuals do. So a free spirit is detached to a large degree from the traditions, morals, and general ethos of the community in which he or she lives. So again, somebody who's not exactly following along with where society wants to go. Okay, so why is this important? And what is this makes this not just, okay, you've got some interest in eccentric people and you want to talk about how great they are. Well, I think in a democracy, in a large-scale democracy like ours, the free spirit can actually play a very important role. They are a model of spiritual freedom, and they show other people how to engage in this sort of behavior. So let's talk a little bit about how the free spirit relates to politics. I think we can look at this relationship from two angles. One is, what does society owe a person like this? And then secondly, what does this person contribute to society, if anything? Or is it possible that they're a free rider, that they're a parasite? Well, from the first question is actually, it brings us back to the question about institutions. What sort of rules we have for our framework of liberty, and whether or not we can accommodate these sorts of people. So the first question is, would a free spirit be accommodated and accepted in society? And if so, is that society truly liberal or truly free? My argument here is that Western, the Western constitutions that we see more or less take care of this institutional problem. We don't need new institutions to accommodate the free spirit. Our First Amendment, freedom of speech, free exercise of religion, freedom to petition, all of this covers what the free spirit needs to do. But what we might find is, even though there's no institutional problem, there is a cultural problem. That culture itself doesn't necessarily value or accept these sorts of people, even if our government structure does. There's always the argument as well that if culture is somehow ultimately in the long run going to determine political institutions, there's a danger going forward. Let's look at the other angle now, though, the role that free spirits play in society and why they are important. I believe that free spirits, in whatever guise they come, will actually bring more benefits to society than costs. Clearly, free spirits do not intentionally work for the benefit of society. They are more concerned with detaching themselves from it. And they're more concerned with their own individual spiritual pursuits. But their political role might be suitably explained through something like Adam Smith's invisible hand, right? The metaphor of the invisible hand, that as people pursue their own self-interest, they end up benefiting society as well. I think this is precisely what free spirits do. The free spirits' quest for individual spiritual freedom, for this intellectual freedom, and then this ability to pursue their own happiness in a sense. I mean, spiritual fullness is a little different. But this actually shows other people in society what it's like to do these things. And I think this is not a trivial point. I think that people like to think that we have free speech, we have freedom of religion, we have freedom of thought, and that there's a marketplace of ideas, right? This is the sort of John Stuart Mill idea of a liberal society. This is what it means to be liberal. And we pay a lot of lip service to that. But I don't think we actually see that many different viewpoints, and definitely not radically different viewpoints when you look at public discourse in general. It's important to actually be shown how doing things differently, what it actually looks like. A statement from Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard sums this up pretty well. He says, "Aren't people absurd? They never use the freedoms they do have, but demand the freedoms they don't have. They have freedom of thought. They demand freedom of speech." The question, and what he's asking here, is how many truly take advantage of the freedom of thought and belief that they have, right? We see people constantly claiming the right of free speech. I have a right to say this. Nowadays, we actually see more than that. We see people claiming rights of recognition. You have to recognize me and recognize the way I might be, my identity, my activities. But that seems to be something that's like kind of jumping the gun, right? How many actually use their freedom of thought before sort of clamoring for some of these other cherished freedoms that we do have? I'm hoping that view doesn't appear too cynical, because what I'm actually getting at is that the idea that free thought is a lot harder to come by than most people think it is. It's the exception rather than the rule, I would argue. I think in your own life, I'm sure you could come up with many examples of where this is the case. But if you think about just news headlines, most people don't really know much more than the news headlines, partly because it's very, very difficult to do the research and come up with the information necessary to have a very, very strong and well-informed opinion about something. But we constantly parrot, and I do it myself. I do it myself in the classes I teach. We constantly parrot other people's conclusions, other people's thoughts. Really coming to individualized thoughts is the exception rather than the norm. So I think that when we think about independence of mind, it's a goal that we should constantly aspire to rather than something that we automatically have, right? In some ways, people think of the rights that we're given, just think of the Bill of Rights, as these possessions that we're just automatically possess. But they have to be exercised, they have to be used, and freedom of thought actually comes before the use of many of them. So I think free spirits, by being who they are, actually sort of show this radical skepticism, radical doubt, and individuated responses to things that are happening in the world. They urge us to greater skepticism and scrutiny of the prevailing opinions of the day. They are a check on and an alternative to fanaticism and ideology. They're not going to fall in line with mass movements because, again, if you remember, their highest value is being untethered, is being detached from these mass movements. I think part of the reason that I was interested in doing this research, working on this project, is that mass media, public opinion, political partisanship, they constantly threaten genuine deliberation, right, and genuine political discourse. And I think we actually find that true independence of spirit and the strength to guard it is rare. But because it's rare, impression on others. People who really do swim against the tide, they leave a strong impression, assuming they're not immediately laughed off before they can make that impression. But that's another question. And today, I think we see the fruits of a lot of social pressures, mass political movements, mass cultural movements, where you're not seeing people who are willing to take individuated, independent stances. I think this is especially true on college campuses. I'll have to confess my sins. If I get obsessed with anything, it's poring over the internet for college scandals about safe spaces, trigger warnings, shutting down speakers. There's been lots of this in the last few years. And it tends to always take the same sort of cycle, the same sort of process occurs everywhere. But there's clearly something happening where fighting against what some people might say PC culture, I found that, I mean, it's a little simplistic, but gets the point across, that fighting against PC culture is getting less and less common, especially amongst the youth. Anyway, so that's actually something, I'm welcome to take questions about, but I think that you need more people caring more about spiritual freedom in order to combat some of these negative trends. Okay. Let me just check. We're doing pretty good on time? 12:35. Okay, yeah, so I've got a little bit of time. So I want to return just briefly to where I started and talk about the importance of spiritual freedom in general. The danger, I believe, in only talking about freedom in terms of civil liberties and political or economic institutions is that by focusing on questions merely of the technical variety, we risk achieving and perpetuating a merely technical understanding of freedom. Again, I just want to say this is a positive result of lots and lots of years of political science and history, where we are able to talk about freedom in a technical way. But we still need to beware of only talking about it in that way. There are many ways to think about this. I'm just going to try to drive the point home a little more by talking about Max Weber's characterization of the modern state. Right? Max Weber was a German sociologist, hugely influential in the intellectual world. And what he said was that the modern state, the most important characteristic of the modern state is that it is rational. Right? It's marked by rationalization. That is, the primary activity of the modern state is dealing with the technical problems of administration that arise and to take care of these problems in a rational way. Right? So here's where you get the rational bureaucrat, right? Who's just trying to follow the most rational process for taking care of whatever administrative duties need to be taken care of. This is the way of thinking about political rule then, as a rationalized bureaucracy. So then the use of reason, the use of one's mind in this case, becomes instrumental. There's administrative goals that we must reach. We're going to find the best way to reach from A to B. So this instrumental or calculative use of reason can be contrasted with a sort of thought that is a little more free. And I think this sort of thought, we can think about it in different ways. In some ways, it's more messy. It's a little more out there. But it's not. There's still actually a lot of historical talk about this sort of thinking. It goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks. For example, Aristotle talks about contemplation, right? He uses this word contemplation a lot. For him, this isn't about, in a Max Weber, in a Weber sense, okay, I have a goal, I have a starting point, and this is where I want to end up, and I'm going to find the best way to do it, and my reason is a tool to get me from point A to point B. When Aristotle talked about contemplation, it was actually, in his mind, the highest form of moral activity. And for him, the life of contemplation was the best life. It was a way of actually seeing new possibilities, understanding yourself better, understanding the world better. But there was a moral component to it for Aristotle. I think that most religions will talk about something similar, right? Meditative or religious thinking, something that, we're thinking about the meaning of things rather than having a goal to reach or some sort of rational process. And then, if any of you have read any existential philosophers, whether it's Nietzsche or Kierkegaard or Heidegger or any of these sorts of people, they'll talk about a sort of an ecstatic thinking. There's a sort of ecstasy in wondering about the world and coming to conclusions that are new and different, and the sort of possibility that arises out of that sort of thinking. But any way you want to, whatever you want to call this, the point is that there's a type of thinking that makes us feel free. Right? You feel like a free person. This is something that's not common throughout human history, but you feel free when you're actually thinking for yourself and not following some sort of process that's already put in place, some sort of technical process. And this sort of thinking is linked to the spiritual freedom I talk about. As I said, this is a bigger project, so a lot of these parts move together. But this thinking, if I'm in any way impressing upon you this idea of, oh yeah, I've thought that way sometimes, or I do think that way sometimes, that's linked to this idea of spiritual freedom that I try to bring out. So in conclusion, spiritual freedom is something we need more of, and something that we should, I think, accept and tolerate more when we see other people who might be, frankly, just thinking a little out there. Even if it doesn't go anywhere, there's positive results just to have people acting in that way. And I said at the start that spiritual freedom is more inspiring and generative than the other ways of talking about liberty, institutions, and legal stuff, civil liberties, civil rights. What I mean by that is I think it's more capable of reproducing itself over time. Put simply, I think emphasizing spiritual freedom is a necessary supplement to our technical understanding of ordered liberty. Passing down civil liberties and free institutions to the next generation is a great gift, and we should be grateful to our founders and the generations since for this. But I also think it's important to realize that passing down an inspired feeling of what it means to be free may be greater. And it may be the best defense against those who over time chip away at the framework of ordered liberty. One way to think about that is that we have a political structure, but we also have a very strong civil society and very strong culture. And culture is something that I think if there was a place for liberty lovers, because I can talk freely about being a liberty lover here in a way I can't when I'm on a university campus. But for liberty lovers is to inject themselves into that cultural dialogue. And I think thinking about spiritual freedom and talking about spiritual freedom can be a way to do this. Of course, I know it's abstract, but you can have it in your mind that there's a sort of freedom that is more inspiring, more romantic, and use it as you sort of fight the battles that need to be fought when it comes to liberty. I think I could take questions now. I could say a couple things about, I think we're here in the Education Policy Center, and that's what I wrote on when I was here working with Pam, and education is very important to me. And I think education is a particular place where we have to understand that there's different ways of thinking, but also different modes of thinking, and that it's hard. And I think it can be hard to have these sorts of debates in a setting where you're sitting around a table with a bunch of other policymakers or a bunch of people invested in the political process. it tends to be a sort of technical conversation, right? You're talking about the current legislation, the past legislation, the makeup of the Board of Education, the makeup of the state legislature. It's a lot of technical problems you're trying to deal with to push stuff through. And that's important. I mean, I don't do that sort of work, so I don't know that much about it, but of course it needs to be done. But in something like education, we also need to keep in mind what exactly we're trying to protect and safeguard. And in the education system itself, in the curriculum, in the teachers, and the administration, we need to protect this ability for people to truly think independently and not say that. I mean, part of my beef, I guess, and the reason I even got into this project to begin with, is that people really like to pat themselves on the back and talk about thinking critically and thinking independently. It's on almost every education brochure. But I think it's important to realize that's very, very rare, and it's very, very hard to achieve, but that it is a worthy goal.